Right. Nice to see everyone in the room, both rooms. So my name is Reverend Lien Shutt. My pronouns are she and they. Well, I will say that I've been doing a few of these for the book and said, well, what about the situation with Hamas and Israel? And how does this book answer any of that? And so the book is about how to heal from oppression, racism in particular, or more specifically and more broadly. It is a reframing of the Four Noble Truths into what I call the Engaged Four Noble Truths. That's been funded by the Hamera Foundation since 2017. After I was at a Gen X teacher conference, in which around that time there was another round of sexual misconduct coming to the light, so to speak, in some of North American sanghas. So the right use of power was brought in as a model. Do people know the right use of power? Oh, it's by Cedar Barstow, who's a social worker. So I really appreciate that. And it's the sense is that there's a whole book and there's whole trainings. But in a nutshell, it's about how in every situation there's a power differential. So the main thing is that there's what's called a down power and an up power. And so we need to be aware of that in a situation, and it can change in any moment. For instance, as a person of color, I'm in the down power position in the system of oppression of racism. But as someone who has a master's degree in social work, I'm in the up power and access to labor. These are general. And therefore, most of us in any situation can shift in power. And so how it helps us to have a sense of what might be appropriate response. For instance, one could reply in a way and in retrospect think, oh, that's from a down power. And yet, if I perhaps should have responded from an up power position, might have been better. For instance, right now, just say something racist happens towards Asians, and I am therefore, classically would be in the down power position. However, I'm in the teacher seat, so I have some power, and in fact, probably I have the power in the room, and so I should actually take care of the situation in the room, the more organizational. So it helps us to, I find it very useful both in terms of responsibility and then also in terms of how I might have responded in one way and then go, it would have been useful to remember where I'm in this power differential. And so that's useful. So in terms of the Four Noble Truths, in terms of the engaged version, we start out as a restoration point that there, not just that there's dukkha in life, but that in fact there's hurt and harm. Because restoration really happens once there's that admission that something is wrong or broken or has been devalued. And in fact, that's how restoration begins, when that's agreed upon. And a lot of mediation is about trying to figure out how we can agree on what the problem is. And restoration is also needed when we say, from here, how will we do things differently? Not just something's wrong, I'm sorry, but it has to be a commitment. And so the second noble truth then is, what are the causes and conditions of hurt and harm, which sounds a lot like the original one, except we focus more on structural conditioning and not just individual conditioning. And then the third noble truth is, how can we connect to agency in the midst of hurt and harm, both individual and collective agency? And then the last is that the Eightfold Path, in fact, empowers us to be skillful in finding agency for ourselves and with others. So when Lien asked that question, I said, oh, gosh, pretty big there. And also, nope, nothing in here very specifically talks about that. And then I thought very much about, and I had wanted to talk about skillful concentration in particular as providing stability. And then I thought, what really comes up for me is a sense of appropriate response. And in fact, from there, though, it's not knowing. So in skillful mindfulness, I have this to say. Each of these chapters begin with a story, a personal story that helps illuminate for me that Eightfold Path factor. But I'm not going to read it because it seems pretty small compared to the question. However, in skillful mindfulness, I talk very much about how we start out that there's an issue, and then we do have ways of working with the issues. And by the time we get to skillful mindfulness, we actually also have to say that we don't know. Because it isn't just about knowing what needs to be done, because we have to be open to possibilities of different ways of approaching, especially when the conflict is confusing or complex or layered. We have to be able to be with uncertainty, with not knowing. Dogen, the Japanese founder of Soto Zen, often taught that practice and realization are not separate. In the doing is how we know and how we realize. So we just have a word, practice realization. Our practice is a liberating practice, which is to say we have to learn to go beyond individual and structure. That's another way that you can think about when we respond from an individual sense, usually it's of down power, right? When we can have that resonance of another person's injustice against another. Often there's a personal, individual kind of connection. And then there's what we say is the larger or structural. And yet we can't just stay with that dichotomy. How can we also connect to the openness that's beyond duality and dichotomy? Maybe you're saying to me, tell me where that is. I want to get there right now. And my answer is, it isn't a place. It's right here and right now. In Zen, we say we don't wake up to another life. We wake up to this life. We wake up to realizing how we've been perceiving or viewing things. We wake up to knowing there are other ways to be in life if we're willing to open up our view to how we perceive and conceptualize. One way is to see beyond duality, is to see that it isn't just personal or just structural. They are always in relation to each other. We need to pay more attention to how they interact with each other. This is a way to go beyond duality. We are taught in many ways, and certainly by white supremacy culture and other forms of oppressions, that the main place to enact our agency and power is as individuals. It isn't emphasized that we also have collective power. Furthermore, the key isn't asserting one or the other as better or as shoulds. A way to work with overcoming dualistic framing is to practice putting our attention and practice on how to negotiate between our relative and absolute experiences. Relative can be understood as a personal, individualistic experience. When we hear absolute, we might understand it as objective. However, in Buddhism, until we are a Buddha, one who fully and consistently, that's the hardest part, I think, perceives and acts from wholeness, we are never objective, as we only see from our conditioned sense of the world. This is the engaged second noble truth. The causes and conditions that give each of us a particular point of view and corresponding behavior in the world. It's not that we don't know absolute. It's that once we put it into words, it becomes conditioned by language at the minimum, and thus no longer absolute. Whenever we name absolute, it is through this body, this heart, this mind, and thus relative. I think in a complex situation like what's happening in the Middle East, and I lived in Egypt during the time in which the negotiating with Sadat and just before he was assassinated. So this has been an ongoing thing way before that too. And also, the thing I keep thinking about the Middle East situation is, and it's because we just had Indigenous Peoples Day, right? Is that, yes, lots of oppression, and yet a whole group of people was moved onto another people's land. And so how can we not think that it's going to cause conflict that's ongoing, right? And so it's really layered and complex. And so we want to go, they're wrong, they're right, they're this, they're that. And where does that get us except more conflict? So to me, part of it is being able to actually admit that we have limited view. And that's actually part, I think, of skillful mindfulness. Essentially, while we can have a sense of broader experience, as conditioned humans, we are only able to describe and share it in relative ways. From deep practice, I realize I suffer most when I'm clinging to my individualistic idea or relative sense of what the absolute or structure should be. Individualistic and structure are not diametrically opposed. They intertwine, they inter-are. Understanding this can be healing. For instance, when I understood racism as a structure of white supremacy, that's when my healing from racism began. I began understanding that while it felt personal, it also wasn't personal because it's systemic as well. Mind you, it doesn't mean that it doesn't still hurt. But from this broader, more inclusive understanding, the hurt of the experience shifts to an understanding of its harmful impact. Paradoxically, this then gives me the space to attend to the hurt more as a way to let go of lasting harm. It was a liberatory moment to realize I have a choice as to how much I'm willing to let a racist experience hurt me in this moment and from now on. So in skillful mindfulness, I developed what I call the three corrective movements of liberatory awareness. And it started because the courses that came from this development in early 2020, when yet another rise of anti-Asian violence and hatred rose, a lot of Asian American students reached out for support. And as I was developing these, I offer a course called Lotus Rising from the Mud. How do we work with the result of the impact of that? And then with George Floyd's murder, then we did one in which we, with other teachers, in which from our racialized location, because white supremacy culture impacts us all. And so from that, we, in the Lotus group, we are reading Kathy Park Hong, People read Minor Feelings. If you haven't heard of it, I suggest it. She's actually a writer, and so she does some literature kind of critique and stuff, but it is very much about how the dialogue in North America in terms of race is very much a black and white issue. And so where do Asian Americans fit into this? And one of the things she talks about is that she quotes Linda Martine Alcoff, who's a feminist philosopher and theorist on race stuff, who wrote, just blanked on her book, but about the position of white in both North and South America, because she's from South America, she's mixed race. And she talks about how, Linda Martine Alcoff, how W.E.B. Du Bois talks about Black people having to have a double consciousness, right? Because they have to have a sense of the Black self and the larger white culture. And that how with the racial reckoning of things, white people had started to have a sense of white double consciousness, that you also had to see Black view, right, or another view. And I thought that was very interesting, but yet again, nothing about another view. And so as I was investigating, I thought, what might be for Asian Americans? And then I came with these, and I think they can be used for all views. And so one begins with what I call our assimilated views. Those are the views that we were taught, that we've assimilated as truths. Right? Take Indigenous Peoples Day, right? How many years we were like Columbus Day? And we all, I mean, most of us for many years now have been like, not quite it. And yet Columbus Day was still how we were talking about it and having a sense of it. And it wasn't enough movement for it to shift. And then, I was just in Brooklyn and over the holiday, and we were all saying to each other on the calendar, on my Google Calendar, actually says both, right? Columbus Day and Indigenous Peoples Day. But other people were saying in New York, or in Brooklyn at least, they just kept hearing Indigenous Peoples Day. Like nobody said Columbus Day anymore. And so there's this shift of us realizing our assimilated truth, right? This truth that we had held as a certain way of viewing how this country was developed, right? How this continent. And so this is an example of like awakening to how we have assimilated truths. Now, I know that when we wake up to realizing our assimilated truth, there can be the next one, which is called reactive truth, which is we react to that. I know in terms of Indigenous Peoples Day, so at A to Z, we do meet on Monday nights, which is often where many holidays happen, right? And so we do not meet on Columbus Days, right? Because it's not a holiday that we support. And yet when it became Indigenous Peoples Day, started last year, we now take it as a holiday. And so in a way it's reactive, and reactive doesn't make it bad, mind you, but it's a reaction to something. And I think, a sense of this, right? See if it works for you, is that it's part of the movement, and yet we're still, what makes it reactive is that it's still in relation to that other power that we give power to, a structure that we give power to. It isn't necessarily completely or mostly self-powered or collective self, like as a community. And so then that takes us to what I call clarifying truth, or as it is, which is a Zen thing, but I realize is a very specific, Shunryu Suzuki Roshi, he always says, things are as it is. with hyphens in there. And I'll hold that as a way of framing it. Or a liberatory truth, a truth in which we feel that there's a sense of empowerment, not only individual empowerment, but a collective empowerment. And it isn't, now, the thing is, it isn't necessarily make one worse than the other. It's just knowing where you are in your awareness of things. And I think we can also move, in a topic or in a way that we see things. And it's in a way waking up to where is our location, or where is it that we have an awareness about. And it's just a model to kind of go, oh, okay. Now, am I acting in this way that is reactive, and is that how I want? I think sometimes, like if there was marching that was going to happen in response to what happened in the Middle East, then maybe, is that reactive truth? I would be, yeah, I'm mad as hell. I'm going to go out there and march, maybe I would have gone, sorry, Stephen, I'm going to go marching in the street instead. We could say that's reactive, but I'm okay with that because it's also something that I'm want to put power behind, and as a community, I support. So again, just because I have these named to them, I think we sometimes think, oh, reactive, that's something I'm trying to get away from. And I think there's some sense that I don't want to live always, being knee-jerked and giving power to things. However, just because it's something you've done was reactive, doesn't necessarily make it reactive now, right? So it's not so much about the thing, it's about your motivation for doing it. And remember, motivation is like the key thing in Buddhism, right? What is the motivation behind what we do, not so much the thing itself, right? So the context of things, the motivation, the skillful thinking, that is the drive behind your actions. So, I will leave it at that by ending here with, and then I'd like to open it up for discussion. In each moment, are you open and willing to see a truth for what it is? Can you include that not knowing is also present? We need to have some sense that newness and possibility is liberation. Are you willing to be responsible for the truth you see? Does it bring hurt and harm, or does it bring more connection, more love, more joy for you and those in your life? Ultimately, this is what it comes down to. Can we not have a static or fixed sense of things, but one within context? Openness and awareness of context is one way to define skillful mindfulness. In the context of racism or oppressive systems, it's largely about incorporating inclusive history and activating intentional presence that will engender a non-harming future. I'm at Russian River, sitting on the back deck, gazing out at the river on a bright morning. That's where I wrote. I went for 6 weeks and stayed for 11 months. Thank goodness for Sangha members. I can see a long, long strand of spider web blowing in the breeze. I see a tiny little spider on one end, gently undulating amidst a clear blue sky. Where is the beginning of the strand? I can't see where it's attached, but that spider knows. In the spring, baby spiders hatch. A new spiderling has to be willing to jump off and trust the conditions, such as wind, to take it somewhere else where it will land and start its own web. It carries with it some inherited sense of tradition, but it has to be willing to jump into the unknown and go off on its own to start its own web, its own liberated life. This back deck has a fence with a row of spider webs on it. As an animal rights person, I don't clear away cobwebs or webs much. So now there's a whole community there. We have to have this sense of openness to know what is present, what we've inherited, and what is important to us. We also have to have awareness that there is always going to be not knowing. Therefore, we have to have the resilience to meet conditions in which things don't go as planned, and that things can fall apart, and yet we have the capacity to find centeredness, to not be overwhelmed, and to trust our experience of wholeness as ourselves, as others, and as life conditions right here and right now, as it is. So the meditation we did at the beginnings from this chapter, in fact, and in the Brahma Viharas, as I said in there, but I want to really reiterate, is upekkha is very specifically the stability or the centeredness that comes from realizing karma as a real force in life. And also, in the four Brahma Viharas, upekkha is often, why there are four of them, upekkha is often thought of as either the foundation or the roof, the foundation that supports the other three, metta, karuna, and mudita, or as the roof that protects them. So it's a very, it's the stabilizing force so that the other three factors don't go too wary, to either too high or too low, or too left or too right, and those dualities, right? So it stabilizes us and it centers, and it gives us in the stability, we don't fall deeply into despair or into the highs of the absolute, how things should be. Thank you. Thank you for listening.